Well, thank you very much for that, John. Vice-Chancellor and Chancellor, may I just say what an absolute joy it is to hear a Vice-Chancellor talk so passionately and excitedly about learning and teaching. So thank you very much for that, Vice-Chancellor. And I don't think I've ever presented when both a Chancellor and Vice-Chancellor have stayed in the same room for the entirety, well, they may not, depending on how I go. I'm starting a little bit late, and I was worried in any event about getting through my time, so perhaps you better stop me when you've had enough. It'll be a bit of a journey, if you don't mind. I'm very anxious to try and share with you some practice from across the sector internationally around the first year experience. There's a lot of research and work has been done. I have a very strong sense, even in a very short period of time being here, that you are, as the Vice-Chancellor has said, very committed and interested, and I'm very admiring of your STAR project. So everything that I do and say over the course of the next 30 or 40 minutes will be from the point of view of hopefully providing you with some other ideas. And there'll be a range of practical examples enmeshed with a few theoretical things. So when I was trying to think how to start a presentation like this, Hillary Clinton wrote this book, It Takes a Village to Raise a Child. I think it takes a whole of an institution to support, engage and retain students. So that's my thesis to a large extent, that this is whole of institutional practice. I managed to get into my previous institution's policy that the first year experience was everybody's business. That's not very policy speak, but it's what I truly believe, and that includes the students, of course. So what I want to talk to you about today is something a little bit about the material that's out there around the first year experience. I want to very much attempt to pursue this theme of a transformative whole of institution approach to the first year experience, not for its own sake, but for engagement, success and retention. And the transition pedagogy that I developed under the fellowship that John spoke of is very much centred around the curriculum, because if students are going to be engaged, they need to be engaged in their learning. And the curriculum I conceptualise as a very broad, it's the totality of students' experience with us. It's everything that they do with us. It's their engagement academically and socially. Vincent Tinto, who's very big in the first year experience space, talks about the educational conditions in which we place students and our environments. And I know Hamilton's going to talk shortly about learning spaces. Everything we do, all of their interactions with us are the educational conditions in which we place students and have the potential to engage or disengage students depending on how they experience that. So I want to talk about that and harnessing the curriculum very much as the social and academic organising the device. So the curriculum is the glue. And I'm going to try and give you some examples around that, show you a little bit of a DVD and try to, as I take you on this fairly whirlwind tour, provide some practical examples of what that might look like. Very briefly, if I might just mention what's happening in Australia at the moment. We've got a bit of a perfect storm, as the Vice-Chancellor has said. We are way beyond incremental change. This is serious business for us in Australia now. We have a new tertiary regulation and quality standards agency, which has very much shifted the focus from inputs, which is all around curriculum design, to outputs, demonstrating that students have actually achieved the learning outcomes that we've always claimed that they do. We've got a demand-driven system now. The government used to impose caps on particular degree courses, so you could only have 100 creative arts students or whatever. They've taken all those caps off. Universities now can take as many students as they like and they get funded for them. But there's been a bit of a moral panic around this. If we're going to enable widening participation, there's according to all the clever people, necessarily standards will drop. So we're trying to balance now equity and widening participation with an assurance of learning standards. And I just put up there our widening participation targets that the government has set us. We'll probably make the 40% of Australian population by 2025 of 25 to 34-year-olds having a bachelor's degree. We're going to struggle with the 20% low SES, low socioeconomic status students participating in higher education by 2020. That target has been flatlining for about a decade and a half, around 15 or 16%. and it's slowly creeping up, but probably not as fast as we need to make that target. So again, there's a lot of attention in Australia being paid around the sorts of issues that I imagine that you that you face most days. And in my DVC, in my Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic hat, I can't talk about challenges anymore. I have to talk about opportunities. So there's opportunities to engage students in the transformative effects of widening participation. And you have a very multicultural and multilingual society. We have a range of students in our classroom, many of them coming from non-traditional backgrounds who we need to support and be true to the promise. So as you saw on that slide, there's an issue for us around pathways, and I see from looking at your website, and I have had quite a good look at your website, which is, you know, the student perspective. That's how students go in and find information. So I always trial this out on any institutions that I come and present at. But I see that you're engaged in those similar things. At James Cook University, we're setting up a pathway college. We're talking about foundation studies. We're talking about how we might be very clear about students making that transition to higher education. And the last thing I wanted to mention in terms of the regulatory environment was you've heard of WikiLeaks, of course, or not necessarily. Well, now there's UniLeaks. I hope it comes to you, your university Vice-Chancellor, because it's very exciting when you get mentioned because you've done something terribly exciting that gets on with UniLeaks. But, you know, this is part of the regulatory environment now. It is, you know, we bring students here to learn, but they consider themselves often consumers. So we will be subjected to that sort of rigour of investigation. And in Australia, the government has the federal government, the Commonwealth government, has also just set up a My University website. Now, the My University website contains a lot of quite rude data on it about how our institutions perform. So, for example, on the My University website is mentioned the fact that in Australia, and I was interested to hear your Vice-Chancellor specifically refer to this, in Australia we have relatively high rates of first-year attrition for domestic students. The average is around 18%. 18% of students don't go on to second year, and that doesn't count all the students who drop out before they start counting. That's at about week 4 of the first semester. But that 18% ranges across the institutions and across the states and territories of Australia from a low of around 7% from a very elite institution, but still 7%, to a high of about 38 or 39% for Bachelor Institute in the Northern Territory, which has mainly Indigenous students. So, you know, we have some issues to deal with. I should say that I'm imagining that these slides will be made available after the presentation. So I would be very annoyed if I was me trying to listen to this because I couldn't keep up. So when we think about the student life cycle and how we conceptualise our institutional approaches around recruitment and retention and what the university vision might be, and the intentionality of us managing the life cycle and the multiple transitions that students are making. Actually, I've got a pointer. No, perhaps not. Oops. I've done the wrong thing. No, I was looking for a pointer. Perhaps I don't have one. So we come in, and there's a lot that we can do at every stage of the transition cycle, is my point. As long as we have an institutional vision around what that is supposed, and we're very consistent in our messaging around that. So right from aspiration raising, which is what a lot of our equity practitioners are doing now to try and get our low socioeconomic status participation up, through recruitment, through offer and enrolment. We have a lot of online enrolment in Australia, so we lose a lot of students before they even start engaging in our institutions. They can enrol online, they can disenroll online. Orientation and transition, intentionally leading into first year, and then all of the transitions through the degree transition out, and there's a degree of work now being done around the transition out. And for me, that makes a nice synergy. You close the loop on transition in by assisting the transition out into the alumni and postgraduate possibilities. Or if we think about the first year experience another way, and if you can remember what it was like for you when you first came to university, there you are, happily motoring along in your gender-neutral green car, and then things start happening all around you before you even, and there are all these things that you don't even know what half of them mean. I remember this very clearly as a first-year university student when I was 16. And then they have to actually immerse themselves in the environment, and it all becomes quite new. They're making academic, environmental, social and other administrative transitions. And this is before they even start getting into their course. So then they start, overlaid over the top of that is everything that's happening around the course. And the poor little first years, no wonder they fade away, I think. So I think a lot of our first students are pushing at the institutional door that says pull. And Hamilton, you as an architect, you should do something about that. And so the point which is made, and it's not a very big or intellectual point, but of course student success is largely determined by the student experience of first year. Engagement matters, and it matters most in the first year. This is where students start to develop their habits and patterns of study. There is overwhelming evidence that the more resourcing that we put into the first year experience, the more successful our students will be, and it's a strong indicator of institutional commitment. And I say here, it's a hearts and minds commitment to students to make a difference to their lives. So just trying to crystallise the first year issue for you. This is a lovely article if you ever get the time to read it. And it talks about the necessity for students to master their student role, to overcome the gap that they might have in social and cultural capital that non-traditional students have, not because they're silly or stupid or they can't engage, it's just they don't come from that background and with that experience. So then students need to understand the hidden rules of what it is to be successful. And so here's a student talking, I'm taking biology, this is in the American context, I don't have experience in writing, and the main thing that they require writing for is research papers, and I'm expecting, students expect to work hard at university. I did 2 papers and the teacher said, you have to go back and do that again, this isn't scientific writing. I thought it was because it came from a biology textbook and I'd studied that at community college, and he said, no, this isn't scientific writing. So the important thing is it's really hard to see what they want because they see it. They already know it, but they see what I don't. So how do we bridge that gap? Because it's hard for students. And I would say if that student, it's not my own institution, if that student went to La Trobe University, in the very first year they get a very clear guide that helps them bridge that gap and helps them master the hidden rules about what it is to do scientific report writing. My background is law. I would be lost. And think about that. If you're arts and humanities, think about doing engineering. If you're science bent, think about doing something like law. I would be lost trying to understand the hidden rules around what scientific writing is, because I would come with my experience and it wouldn't work, is my suggestion. So we know from the work that's been done in Australia that the non-traditional students will be as successful as their higher socioeconomic status and their mid-socioeconomic status colleagues, to the percentage of about 97%. But they require higher levels of support to succeed. So when my colleagues, and I have some quite, I don't think I'm allowed to say unhelpful anymore, recalcitrant, I don't think I'm allowed to say that either. So my colleagues, when they come and speak around the table, they say these students aren't interested in working. Well, what I would say is they come expecting to be challenged, and we need to present them with that challenge. But equally, we need to present them with the support that they need to engage in the challenge. Inclusion is an international agenda around this, so there's been a lot of work done in the United States for a long period of time. There's about 4 decades, almost 5 decades of work over there. Vincent Tinto and Bill Tierney talking about low-income students, George Koo talking about underserved students, so again, low-income first-generation minority students. In the UK, there's a lot of work going on. I've just picked out one because I'm going to take some quotes from this. So this is Sandra Griffiths talking about teaching for inclusion and the need to access a variety of backgrounds. In New Zealand, there's been a long emphasis on priority learners. Again, the sorts of low-income Māori students in particular, and low SES Pacifica students. So a real effort to try and engage these students. And I know it's not exactly on point, but it was the best I could find on your website, but I'm actually more interested in this because we know from equity practitioners that getting into the schools is the first point of contact. So with your Pride project, which I don't know whether it's still ongoing, but again, forgive me, I'm looking across your website trying to find out what's going on in your institution. This is valuable work, and of course it's at the it's not, don't check your this is valuable work that's going on, and it's inclusive teaching. So I'm not going to spend too much time on inclusive teaching per se. There's a whole body of literature out there around that. I'm just going to try and give you some practical examples of what that might look like. The low-income students in Sandra Griffith's study talked about the factors that promote engagement and inclusion, and they're not very clever factors, quite frankly. Respect and equal time for students, being careful in your preparation, presenting material in a structured way, taking time to explain, giving feedback, relating theory to practice, teachers taking an interest in their students, valuing what students bring to the classroom and supporting their interactions. Teachers are all those words that we would normally associate with good teaching, have a sense of humour, able to deal with contentious subjects, and students creating a sense of belonging in the institution. The sorts of factors that inhibit inclusion and engagement are just the reverse. So they're teachers who are not aware of who their students are, who are not interested, who lack the effort to engage, who are elitist and maintain the divide, who don't know their students by name, who don't structure work, who give poor handouts and poor feedback, who allow conflict to generate in the classroom. And I think it's an interesting thing. I see there's a presentation later on today about the affective dimension of teaching. The New Zealanders talk about tertiary education as a family and as a community. So it's that sense of involving them in the journey and caring about them, and students respond very well to those sorts of indicia. So what we in Australia have finally managed to come to realise, I think, that we need to shift our focus from a blame, from a deficit, so it's the student's issue and they need to be injected with academic skills because they don't come with them. It's a student issue, to a focus on success and achievement. And this is Nick Zepke from New Zealand talking now, and he's been saying this for quite a while, from a primary focus on student integration. So students have to change. You know, it's not our fault. Students have to change when they come into our culture. So shift the focus from that to us both adapting. Institutions also need to adapt, and they need to adapt their culture, processes and practices to support diversity. So that's how we came up with this conceptual framework about transition pedagogy and pretty much what's happened to date in relation to the first year experience. To date, I think what's happened is the first generation type approaches was people working on the periphery of the curriculum, so doing all that important services work around orientation and peer mentoring and academic advising, but it was all sitting outside the curriculum. The second generation approach, which I focused on for my, I've just made all this up really, the second generation approach, which was to bring those service activities into the curriculum and recognise the entering diversity and being very specific about and intentional about how we might support students. And the third generation type approaches might be when we finally upscale that and make it available across the whole institution. So it's not just that it happens in your faculty, it also happens in my faculty. And if students are doing in Australia, a lot of students do double degrees, so they're in your and my faculty, and your faculty is going well and my faculties are done, and that's just frankly confusing for them. So that's, you know, the very clever idea around transition pedagogy, being very intentional in your design and scaffolding and mediating the student experience. And once you get academic and professional partnerships, once you get whole of institution approaches, you can do the sorts of things which you see on a lot of websites, but the intentionality may or may not be there. So this is us now trying, sorry, I forgot this is my old institution at Queensland University of Technology, managing the transition process for students on a step 1, respond to your offer, step 2, enrol in your course, step 3, get books and materials, step 4, finances, get your ID card, attend orientation, adjust to university life. It's a very clear, doesn't sound very clever, but it's a very clear articulation of what students need to do. Provide a guide for students, and there's a corresponding guide for staff. And we say, forget Google, ask us, because we know there's a lot of information that we give students very early on in their learning experience of the institution, and it's too early. So this is a real attempt to try and just-in-time information over a period. So if you've got any questions, there are no stupid questions, and we mean that, you know, come and ask us. So we actually have up to week 4 of first semester staff wearing badges to break down that barrier. And it's surprising how students react in those circumstances. And then again, we just provide the QUT, we still do, I'm just not there. Now we provide the opportunities. I've been 3 months at James Cook University, so I'm a little bit longer than John, but I'm still quite new. So I'm hoping to embed a number of these practices also in my new institution. But here's a study planner, and again, the ideas of what you might do to be successful at university managed for you over a state of weeks. I saw that there's one of the presentations over today is an early warning system. I'm sharing the love around. This is the University of New England now, which won an award for its early alert system. So they've got an IT infrastructure, which again is academic and professional staff working together, because you can't manage the corporate data unless you've got nice tame IT professionals who can give you the data that you need to access. So we switched on the student support team's early alert system today, and so proactively information is pushed to students who are determined to be at risk, but over the course of their first semester, not waiting till they've failed, but trying to intervene at an earlier stage. So your name popped up and we're just writing, and it's just, it's quite confidential. And here's a student writing back. Like most of the off-campus mature age students, at times I found uni very challenging. I don't like to ask for help because I assume that everyone else is coping just fine. The problem must lie with me. Thank you for putting this together and making 2011 one of the most promising starts. The study planner, the YouTube diary, the duck dates, it's felt like I'm much more of a community and not just a number. Now University of New England has a high percentage of distance students, and that's again a particular challenge for us. Your multi-campus environment, and I have a multi-campus environment as well, a particular challenge to make students feel as though they're part of a community who cares about them, that they have a sense of belonging. So the premise is pretty simple, that we need to have joined up institutional approaches, embed support wherever they go, curricular and non-curricular, academic and non-academic, generalist and specialist, but have specialist support services available like the UNE Early Alert initiative to catch them if they fall. But once the semester starts and they're time poor, and a lot of non-traditional students are just like us, they're very time poor. Once the semester starts, it's the curriculum that has to act as the organising device. I mentioned the glue before, that does serious transition and retention work. And that's both in and outside the virtual classroom, helping them to unpack, the biology students' hidden rules about what it is to be successful at university. So it's about inclusive curriculum design, facilitation of that mastery of the student role, creating a sense of belonging, facilitating pathways all through the institution, and respecting and valuing what students bring to the classroom. And if we start doing things like that, and I think I see some of this also in evidence in your institution. Here's Charles Darwin University in the north of Australia, who have a lot of Indigenous and a lot of distant students, being really intentional about how they're supporting students to transition to the first year experience by having these common projects which teach things like academic writing in science to be compared with academic writing in the humanities. And this was, again, because I saw the presentation coming up about learning spaces. There's physical and virtual spaces, but here's the University of Queensland being very intentional again about the design of their Science Learning Centre. And I've just given you an article there, and they're researching and evaluating the efficacy of these new centres. So this is just, it is what it sounds like. It's a new space for students to access 24/7. But the critical thing for me is they drive the pedagogy through the centre. So you come to the centre, then all these opportunities are available at the centre. And I'm a beneficiary of that. I have a focus group of one at home who's now in 4th year engineering at the University of Queensland, and there is a similar engineering centre. And during the first year, she spent most of her days losing her shoes and whatever in the learning centre. That's where they congregate together. That's where they had their sense of belonging. So that just gets me to transition pedagogy, and I'm not going very well for time at all. A curriculum focus, as I've tried to mention to you, because we can problematise the diversity, we can problematise the difference amongst students. What they have in common is the learning. Once they come to the university, it's the learning, and the learning is within our institutional control. We can't control their health, their extracurricular responsibilities, their work habits or whatever. We can control the curriculum. and because we have contact with all students. And if we don't do it, if we don't drive everything through the curriculum, the sense of belonging and the intentionality about supporting students with their acquisition of academic skills, then it's all just left to chance, and that's not fair. I was going to show you, I've just gone a bit too far, the academic language and learning advisors are very supportive of curriculum. It's, there's research around this to contextualise the delivery of academic skills. And there's material around English language proficiency, which you'll see on the slides if you access them after time, which I see as one of your graduate attributes. And in Australia, we're paying a particular focus on English language proficiency because it's going to be one of the thematic quality assessments that the Tertiary Education and Regulation and Standards Agency is going to conduct, because we're not doing a good job. And it's not just about international students, it's also about domestic students, and it's not just at the point of entry, it's also over the course of their whole degree. So under my fellowship I came up with 6 curriculum principles. It's a bit like playing higher education word bingo. You won't see any words there that will alarm you, I'm hoping. It's talking about intentional curriculum design that aids transition from wherever they come from, whatever background, to learning in institution. A curriculum that intentionally acknowledges and mediates diversity, and a curriculum that is designed from a student-focused perspective that's intentional and coherent, that enacts engaging pedagogies and enables interactions between staff and students between students from peer to peer. A curriculum that aids transition to tertiary assessment. That's very different from whatever experience students have come from before, and aids the development of assessment literacies, and a curriculum that of course is evaluated in its quality assurance way, but also harnesses the curriculum as the University of New England did with their early alert monitoring to try and pick up students. So because they haven't put in their first piece of assessment, you pick them up and you push resources to them. They fail their first piece of assessment. They don't access the library. They're not accessing their learning management system. You can use corporate data to pick that up. So that's a curriculum that does serious transition and retention work. Diversity is the one that I just want to focus on. Under my fellowship I held a symposium, a first year experience symposium. I was hoping to not be embarrassed. I was hoping about 50 people might come along. In the end I had to shut it down. 400 people came. My proudest boast would be that half of them were academic staff and half of them were professional staff. So it's the academic and professional partnerships that are so critical. So I just wanted to show you a little bit of Symposium the movie. So we had all these experts, and that's Marcia Devlin, Vincent Tinto, Tom Angelo, and our first Indigenous, Sandy O'Sullivan, our first Indigenous Australian Learning and Teaching Council Fellow. And I just wanted to show a short extract from the video where we tried to collect the evidence together around what was good practice.
Acknowledges that first year curriculum should be attuned to and inclusive of the diversity of students entering our higher education institutions.
People tend to think about the kinds of diversity that we can see, ethnic diversity or religious diversity, the things that are obvious to us as mattering, and they of course can matter. Socioeconomic status matters a lot, obviously culture matters a lot, but as far as I can tell, it's really the diversity that we don't see that probably matters most in students' learning and their success. And by that I mean their diversity in preparation for the specific things that we want them to learn. And that's where we need assessment really to help us find out, rather than assuming, to help us find out what students really know and how prepared they are and how ready they are to do the kinds of work that we're asking them to do.
I think the first year curriculum has a really critical role in the retention and success of equity groups, particularly the hidden curriculum. And specifically I think we need to analyse, break down and uncover the hidden curriculum for students. Let them know what sorts of values and beliefs are important in the first year. Let them know how they're supposed to behave and what's acceptable.
In order to create a sense of community for diverse learners, especially in the first year, you need to adopt both pedagogies of engagement, which allow students to learn together in a shared, equal way, and include in the curriculum materials that allow diverse groups to see their lives reflected in those materials.
Well, I think students do start off in different places at the beginning of the semester, and I don't necessarily think they should end up at the same place. I think an individual journey takes place for each student. So as long as they end up in a different place to where they started, and hopefully a place where they've learnt more, hopefully a place where they've experienced more, they've developed knowledge and skills and attitudes, then they don't need to all be the same.
We don't have that many people who are teaching in our institutions, many Indigenous people teaching in our institutions that can actually be role models and work with Indigenous students. That has a big impact when you don't see yourself there, when you don't see yourself represented.
I think what we can do in higher education is design very carefully integrated programs for Indigenous students that incorporate a lot of support wherever possible provided by other Indigenous people, staff and or students, and integrate that very carefully into Indigenous students' experiences.
I think the key issue for a lot of Indigenous students is that many of us didn't actually finish high school. That coming into the university environment is often the first time our students have actually ever completed an essay or begun an essay. And so coming into that kind of environment, it's often the academic rather than the social issues that really come up.
So all that video is available online if there's any particular interest in it. And that, again, that was an example of a partnership between academic and professional staff. Our teaching, our audio-visual people assisted me greatly in that. Now, I'm going to race through the rest of this. Again, I did start a little bit later and I'm going to take that indulgence. But I know you're on a very tight timetable. But I did again want to try to give you some practical strategies around curriculum. So what would that look like in terms of curriculum? Well, it is about inclusive curriculum, as I've mentioned. It's about using the curriculum time to normalise the transition experiences, embedding study support, embedding the academic advising, embedding the possibility of peer mentoring and the self-management skills, self-awareness, persistence, personal organisation, time management, goal setting, study skills. Harnessing peer-to-peer networks, and I see there's a presentation on PASS later on in today's program, peer-assisted study sessions, or supplemental instruction as they call it in the United States. Valuing prior knowledge, so just using the pedagogy that we know about around constructivism, which starts where the students are and brings in, as Sandy O'Sullivan exhorts us to, their experiences into the curriculum. So you build on what they know and where they come from. That you scaffold the academic behaviour, so I said I was from law, so even in law we have quite intentionally workbooks where we scaffold the students' ability to acquire the reading skills around the quite dense legal texts. And proactive at-risk monitoring, and I showed you the University of New England early alert example. There's another example from my old institution. I've now managed to make the transition myself today, the Student Success Project. So I see a number of these initiatives in your institution, certainly around orientation, student learning support and the peer mentoring, and all this wonderful work around student study support. My belief again is that if it sits on the website, students don't go there, it needs to be embedded in the curriculum. But then it's a good news story from the point of view of time-poor academics, because they don't have to develop all these resources. It's all sitting there. You just need to bring it into the curriculum and show students its relevance. Harnessing peer-to-peer interactions are a variety of things. So there's the University of Wollongong. 95% of the University of Wollongong's first-year students are offered PASS opportunities. And there's 70 PASS leaders, peer-assisted study support leaders, so it's offered in every faculty. It's normalised. It's normal that students are assisted by other students across the institution. There's an award-winning program from Macquarie University. This is a student-driven initiative, so students developing peer mentoring opportunities in ancient history, which, as I said, won an Australian Learning and Teaching Council Program Award. And then in my old institution, another way to engage students in peer-to-peer interactions, a student blog. So we appoint, oh not we, they used to, they appoint first-year students, new first-year students, to start blogging about their experiences. They have to abide by the Code of Conduct. QUT does not interfere with what the students post, but it gives them a laptop or a netbook or something or other to help them with their blogging. They're supposed to say some of their top tips, and so here's Claire's little secret for surviving university, your first day. Good normalising stuff, it's going to be exciting and horrifying. I remember stepping into a classroom of over 500 students, totally overwhelmed. Then my lecturer said, The class may seem crowded at the moment, but at least 50 students will leave after a month and only half of you will graduate. So welcome to our institution. So to get you started, I share my tips. I'm sure that happened in another institution, not at ours. So to get you started, I share my tips that I wish someone had shown me. My best tip is sit next to the best looking person in the room. Why would she say that? Well, because interested lecturers will say, introduce yourself to the person sitting next to you. She says she wins if she's sitting next to the best looking person. I thought you might be interested in this resource. This is a project that was funded by the Australian Learning and Teaching Council from the Centre of Study for Higher Education at the University of Melbourne, a range of teaching practices and learning experiences that assist to enable interactions amongst students of diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds. So a whole body of material out there that's just sitting, waiting for you to come and use it. A help-seeking environment. How do we enculturate a help-seeking environment? Because seriously, the difference between university and secondary education often is that in the secondary schools, students would just come and ask, or it would be pushed to them. In the university environment, students have to be quite proactive and help-seeking to be supported. So here's an art student in, again, a wonderful article by Jan Lawrence in 2005. She said, I asked the lecturer for help. Am I on the right track? It helped to a ridiculous degree, to the point that, is that all it takes to do well? Is all I need to do is ask for help and ask questions? That was a big epiphany for me. I asked for and got help and things were clearer. So again, indicating that students don't necessarily know that we're here to help. The Scottish Quality Assurance Agency has done a lot of work around first year as well. They talk about two things, engagement, which we hear a lot about, but also about empowerment. And empowerment, in their understanding, is equipping the students with the academic skills they need to be successful. The research refers to it in various ways, and I just wanted to show you briefly Alf Lizio from Griffith University's model about the 5 senses of student success. So he starts in the middle, a sense of culture. So this is a project that he takes his students through in their course, in their curriculum. Start with the sense of culture, which is about how things are done around here, the cultural competence of what it is to be about university. Go up to the top left-hand corner, a sense of connectedness between peers and staff and the university. A sense of capability in the top right-hand corner to ensure students are learning ready and that they understand what's expected of them in the student role, so giving them the academic skills they need to be successful. A sense of purpose in the bottom right corner is around a sense of vocation and engagement in the discipline and the capacity to set personal goals, which is a lifelong learning skill, and the sense of resourcefulness. So Alf is a psychologist, in case you hadn't picked it up from this sort of idea. So a sense of resourcefulness is a sense about help-seeking behaviour and having students proactively manage their experience. And again, my old university, Queensland University of Technology, there's resources out there would be my point. Putting up very short vignettes around the sorts of issues that students really need help with. How do I ask a question in a lecture? Well, that's a good question. I don't know how you ask a question in a lecture. It depends, is probably the answer. How do I make appointments and have consultations with teaching staff? How do I manage my time? So there's a range of resources there that are available, and you could imagine the teaching staff at the beginning of each of their lectures perhaps just showing one of these short resources on a just-in-time way to help students manage their transition over the period. If I was going to do anything around the first year experience, I'd focus on assessment literacies. I won't take you through all of those. There's a range of things up there around being quite explicit about what the assessment entails, what the assessment expectations are, showing them how to make use of model answers, understanding what feedback is and to make use of them. So in my few minutes, I'm just going to show you some quite specific examples. So in a School of Psychology that Graham Gibbs in the UK talks about, the same assessment definitions and criteria used throughout the entire program. The point of that would be you'll set an essay and you'll call it a research paper, I'll set an essay and I'll call it an extended bibliography. Are we talking about the same thing? Can we have some standard use of language and the criteria in terms of our use of assessment verbs? A brilliant example from my colleague Anna Healy, who's at Queensland University of Technology, in a first year education subject. She gives first year students a piece of text and then takes them through the cognitive hierarchy I know I had trouble with this with my law students. What is it to analyse this in terms of knowledge, understanding and analysis, synthesising or evaluating? So here's a really simple diagram that I would routinely give first-year students now, if I was anyone, because students don't understand necessarily the cognitive hierarchy. The difference between knowing and understanding, which is what their previous educational experience will usually have required of them, and what it is to apply, analyse, synthesise and evaluate. How often do you write on students' pieces of work? This is merely descriptive. Well, where did we ever take the time and trouble to tell them what moving beyond mere description looks like? Plagiarism, one of our biggest issues in Australia. I'm assuming that you don't have that issue here. But what does it mean, apart from saying don't do it? Let's train them about what academic honesty really is. So here's my colleague again, Marcia Devlin, when she was at Swinburne University. There's lots of these examples out there. And I also see, so the University of Western Australia and University of Queensland now use it, and we were talking last night about diagnostic testing in the sciences here at USP, which I think is fantastic. So here's the University of Western Australia and University of Queensland, two very elite institutions in my country, diagnosing and making all students go through an academic honesty exercise at the point of enrolment. So they're in the zone before they even start. Consistency and clarity I was talking about in terms of assessment verbs. Because we have a wonderful librarian, again, academics and professional staff working together, we have standard referencing guides. I don't know whether that's a problem for you, but even in the law school we had two different types of referencing guides. And then we tell students to reference properly and not plagiarise, when we can't even be clear about what the referencing guide is, and whether it's APA with a full stop and a comma or something. So the default position at this institution now is these are the referencing guides. We will not mark you down for doing something different. If the onus is on the lecturer to change it, if that's what the lecturer wants to do. And we have the common naming of assessment tasks. So all students, if they get any sort of, if they get an essay, because that's what you've set them, then this is what an essay means under that policy. I'll leave you to ponder this diagram in your own spare time, but again, it's a very interesting idea about how you manage feedback and make it workable for students and for staff. A common complaint of first-year teachers is we provide all this feedback and students never pick up the assignment. Never. Well, that's because probably it's not consequential. When you feedback on the final piece of work, what are they going to use it for? So this is Janet Taylor from the University of Southern Cross now talking about, building in complexity over the course of your assignments and having a cumulative effect and a consequential effect for feedback. So you said an early piece that's low weight, low feedback, the middle bit still, so an assignment where if it was an essay, for example, then you might ask them to write an introduction and identify 5 articles. Give them some feedback. Then ask them to write the first draft of some portion of it, give them some feedback, and then they put their final assignment in. You don't have to give them very much feedback then because it's not consequential necessarily for them. Making use of feedback, and I'll leave you with these. There are a number of opportunities here. This is the ASK, the Assessment Knowledge Exchange in the UK, had £4 million to investigate assessment practices in the UK. The University of Strathclyde, some wonderful examples there about this is for staff, inculcating in staff that feedback is a dialogue, and then explaining for students how they might make use of feedback. Again, a very useful, students don't come knowing these things. We have to help them understand what it is. So this is about, for me, social justice, equality and equity. It's not a matter of doing a favour by students. We accept students into our institution because of the transformative effects it will have for those students and for their communities. Once a student, however, is within our institution, it's the curriculum, the higher education experience that will dictate retention and success, those educational conditions in which we put them. And this will benefit all students. So I'm just giving you ammunition for any colleagues who say, well, this inevitably means that we're dumbing the curriculum down. Well, there's been some quite robust research in the UK, which we're trying to replicate in Australia, that suggests that the sort of things that you would do to enable non-traditional students to be successful will help all students to be successful and will prove their academic and critical thinking skills as well. So that was all I had, and they'll be available. So thank you.